In the late summer, early fall of 480 BC, one of the greatest defensive battles of all time took place. It was a battle called the Battle of Thermopylae, fought between the Persians and the Greeks. The Greek force consisted of about 7,000 men, while the Persian force consisted of around 1 million. Now, historians don't think that maybe that force was quite that big. They think it was more like 100 to 150,000, but it was still a massive army compared to the 7,000 soldiers of the Greek army. The reason for such a big army is because the last time the Persians tried to invade Greece, they failed, and they were not about to get humiliated the second time. The Greek army was led by King Leonidas, and he strategically settled into a narrow pass that the Persian army was going to have to pass through, and he waited for them. When the Persians came, it was a 2-day battle, with the Persians not making much headway. But then a local resident of the Greeks betrayed them. And he told the Persians of a small shepherd path that led around to behind the Greek force. Leonidas became aware of getting outflanked, and so he sent 6,000 of his men home to save their lives. King Leonidas and 1,000 men stayed to fight the battle. Another 1,300 of his men said that they would stay with him, and so there was 2,300 of the Greek force against 100 to 150,000 of the Persians. It was a bloody battle. All but 400 of the Greeks died, and that 400 surrendered. The Battle of Thermopylae stands as one of the greatest battles of warfare of all time for an army to stand and to defend their country. Whenever a call to patriotism is needed for defense of a country, the armies cry out to remember the Battle of Thermopylae. Any battle needs a battle plan. If you're going to lead an army against another, you need a battle plan. We see illustrations of the Civil War where it seemed as though the two armies just went in against each other, ran into each other, and fought it out. But the general with the battle plan is the one that would usually win. So this morning we're going to examine one of the greatest battle strategies of all time. Only this war was not earthly enemies. The Apostle Paul describes the war in his letter to the church of Ephesus. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. He writes, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." The battle that we're going to read about today is not our battle of spiritual things. It's, however, the greatest spiritual battle of all time. The battle with heavenly consequences was fought here on earth. The victor's prize was the souls of all of mankind. It's the battle between Jesus and Satan that took place in the city of Jerusalem. Let's read about the beginning of the battle, Matthew chapter 21, verse 1. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and at once you will find a donkey tied there, with her colt by her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, say that the Lord needs them, and he will send them right away." This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. "Say to daughter Zion, see, your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." The disciples went and did as Jesus had instructed them. They brought the donkey and the colt, and placed their cloaks on them for Jesus to sit on. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds went ahead of him, and those that followed shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest heaven!" When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, "Who is this?" The crowds answered, "This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee." The amazing aspect of this scene is there's two different perspectives of the participants. Just as in any time you've got more than one person viewing something or participating in something, you get two views of it. And this was the same thing. The people viewed Jesus' triumphant entry as the arrival of their king. Not King Jesus as we know, as the heavenly king, but Jesus as the conquering earthly king. Jesus as their king that would overthrow the Roman government. Jesus as their king that would set them free from the brutal Roman tyranny. Jesus as their king that would free them from the heavy Roman taxes. Jesus as the king, son of David, that would return them to world dominance at the time of their father David in the Old Testament. Why did they have this idea that Jesus was coming as an earthly king? Especially at that time, there were a lot of issues going on here. First of all, as their Messiah, king, this is what they'd expected for hundreds of years. They had been told this by their ancestors, that a king, the Messiah, was coming to rule. And so, as the ancestor of David, they figured that was going to be an earthly rule. Second, the Israelites were accustomed to physical rituals. Remember the animal sacrifices? Those were things that they did. The burning of incense that they could see and smell. The temple rituals. The strict Mosaic laws, the laws of Moses, the do this, don't do that. This is how you do it. You have to do it this way. The Passover ritual, that feast that they had right before the 10th plague as they were in Egypt and then at Mount Sinai, God said you will eat the same meal and remember it year after year. The Israelites were accustomed and full of physical things that they had to do, and thus they viewed Jesus as their earthly king. Third, the freedom that they expected in world dominance. Both of them in their eyes would mean that they got to view Jesus as the king that would physically conquer the world. Fourth, even Jesus' disciples were expecting an earthly king. According to Mark's gospel, James and John came to Jesus and asked, "Hey Jesus, when you come into your power and your kingdom, can we sit one on your right and one on your left?" And Jesus said, "Well, that's not for me to decide, that's for God to decide." And actually, James and John were thinking of the earthly kingdom. And when the rest of the disciples found out about it, the Bible says they were indignant. They were angry and upset with James and John. Why? Well, because they too viewed Jesus' kingship as an earthly kingship, not a heavenly kingdom. Fifth, the Old Testament prophecy of Jesus, their king, riding on the foal of a donkey. We read about this in Matthew's gospel a little bit ago. We find that prophecy in Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9. Zechariah writes, "Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey." The way that Jesus entered Jerusalem on that day solidified their idea of this earthly kingship. Plus, there was other things in the past that solidified this also. In the book of Judges, chapter 10, verse 3, there's a little paragraph. Doesn't say much about this judge. The judge called Jair. He had 30 sons who rode 30 donkeys that ruled 30 cities. In the book of 2 Samuel, after the defeat of David's son Absalom, his son, had rebelled against his dad, David, and tried to become king. David's army defeated Absalom and killed him, and later David returned to the city of Jerusalem a humble and meek man. And thus the Jews on Jesus' triumphant entry saw Jesus as a humble and meek king. Also, David's son Solomon, when he was anointed as king, rode on the back of a mule, which is a cross between a horse and a donkey. So the symbolism of Jesus riding on this donkey gave great significance to the people that this was their Messiah king, earthly conquering king that would rule in Jerusalem. And sixth, all of Jesus' ministry, many of the miracles that he did, he told the people, now, don't tell anybody that I did this. Now, I can't imagine that if he heals you of leprosy or of blindness, you're going to tell everybody. But Jesus didn't want to attract all the attention to him and draw bigger crowds than he already had, so he said, don't tell anybody. But now, as Jesus entered Jerusalem that day for the triumphant entry, it's almost as though he's welcoming their praise, welcoming their shouts, and even as he was entering into Jerusalem, the Pharisees cried out and said, Jesus, quiet the people. Jesus' response was that even if he silenced them, the rocks would cry out. So we can easily see how the Israelite people expected Jesus to come as their earthly king. All their lives they had waited for the Messiah. Their ancestors for hundreds of years had waited for this moment. And now, right then at that day, they were experiencing the coming of their king. But as in most all cases, there's another side to the story. The people had it all wrong. Jesus was coming into Jerusalem, but he was coming to fight a battle. Not the battle of his earthly life, but to fight the battle of all battles. His opponent was Satan. And it was as though he were entering into the boxing arena, going down for the fight of his life. One of the greatest, yet most controversial boxers of all time was a man originally known as Cassius Clay. He later changed his name to Muhammad Ali. You either loved him or you hated him. He had a big mouth, and it got him a lot of attention. The reason for his big mouth and bragging is because he learned early in his career that if you make people hate you, they will pay more to come and see you get defeated. The thing with Ali is that when he bragged that he was the greatest, for the most part, it was the truth. He is still considered one of the greatest, if not the greatest, boxer of all time. And one of the most famous fights that he ever fought in took place between him and Smoking Joe Frazier. It was the third boxing match between them. In 1971, the first bout, Joe Frazier won by unanimous decision in 15 rounds. And he took the title from Ali. They had a rematch in 1974, of which Ali won a controversial 12-round decision over Frazier. The third fight was fought in 1975 and was called the Fight of the Century. It was dubbed the Thrilla in Manila because it took place in Manila, Philippines. The fight took place at 10 a.m. to coincide with being broadcast around the world. The temperature ringside was estimated to be 120 degrees. It was said that there was not a breath of fresh air in the ring. It truly was the fight of the century. Each fighter battered and bruised each other, beating and bashing each other's heads and bodies. And after 14 grueling rounds, Frazier's trainer stopped the fight. Frazier could barely see, his face so swelled he could barely see out of his eyes to fight. Unbeknownst to Frazier's corner, however, is that Muhammad Ali, probably wasn't going to come out to fight the 15th round. He had told his trainers, cut the gloves off. I can't go out and fight it again. Ali was ready to throw in the towel, but Frazier's corner had already stopped the fight. Muhammad Ali had won. But the fight was so intense afterwards, Ali said it was the closest he had ever come to dying. Frazier did an interview after the fight. It didn't last very long, but he was done and left. The press waited for Ali. Where was he at? He was in the locker room lying down, said he was too exhausted to move. 30 minutes later, he came out for the interview. And I want to quote what he said. "What you saw was next to death." End quote. Ali was never the same fighter after that fight. Doctors believe that Ali's Parkinson's syndrome began at that fight. A gigantic fight? Absolutely. But peanuts compared to the fight of all time that Jesus was about to fight that day upon entering Jerusalem. Just as any professional boxer, he had strategically prepared for the fight. Just as any general, he had prepared and planned. He had a strategy. This was war. This was the mother of all battles. When did that war start? 4,000 years earlier. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and he placed Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Said you can eat of anything in the garden, but don't eat of that tree of knowledge of good and evil. They ate. And thus God exacted punishment on Adam and Eve. And when God spoke to the serpent, which was actually talking to Satan, he gave punishment on the serpent, but then God really directed his last toward Satan himself. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, God said, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." Basically, what God is saying here is that one of these days, Satan, he, that is Jesus, is going to crush you. You're going to strike at him, as he did at putting Jesus on the cross, or getting him there, trying to win. But in the end, Jesus was going to crush the head of Satan. So for 4,000 years, God had been waiting for this moment. Planned everything out. Things in history took place that were leading to that moment of Jesus entering into Jerusalem. This is why Jesus came to earth as a baby. The war, that final battle between Jesus and Satan, is why God called Abraham to leave his country and go to this area that we now know as Israel and start a new nation. It's why God called for the Israelites to go into the land of Egypt and to become a great population, a great number of nations, and then the 10 plagues, and then Moses led them out, and then they conquered Israel and they became this nation. It's why we have the Old Testament law of Moses, which was in preparation for this battle. The Old Testament Passover feast was so important to establish the time that the battle would take place. Jesus was in Jerusalem at the Passover. The sacrifices of perfect and unblemished animals so that we could understand the perfect sacrifice of Jesus. The symbolism of the sacrificial lamb to teach us that Jesus was to be the ultimate Lamb of God that would be our sacrifice for us. All of these things were to teach us that we needed to know that as Jesus entered Jerusalem that day, that he was entering the battle of all times. He would triumph. But no one on earth except Jesus knew of the great battle coming between these two warriors, Jesus and Satan. All of his life on earth, Jesus had prepared for this battle. And on that day, as he rode into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey, he was ready to fight, as though the fighter entering the arena is to walk down to the ring with the crowds cheering. But have you ever really noticed and examined what took place between Jesus' triumphant entry and the time of his arrest? Jesus had strategically planned every move, and he, not Satan, had orchestrated the fight. The events that happened defined what led to this battle of all ages. Upon entering Jerusalem, Jesus went to the temple area, and he drove out the money changers. He drove out the sellers and the buyers of these animals for temple sacrifice. He healed the blind and the lame and did other healings, which these incidents angered the religious leaders. The scribes, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees, and the religious leaders that hated Jesus, they tried to trap him by asking him questions. Hey, Jesus, by what authority do you do these things? Jesus, at the resurrection. A wife who's had several husbands, who does she belong to? Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? Jesus, should we actually pay taxes to Caesar? And then Jesus told parable after parable that continued to anger the religious leaders. The parable of the wicked renters, the landlord that established a vineyard and then left. And he sent people back to collect the rent, and they beat them. And then finally the landlord sent his own son back, and they killed his son. The religious leaders knew that that parable was directed at them. The parable of the two sons. The father told the son, go work in the field. The one son said, I won't, but he did. The other son said, I will, but he didn't. That parable was directed at the religious leaders also. The parable of the wedding banquet, when those who were invited didn't want to attend, so the king said, go out and get others and bring them in. Religious leaders knew that was directed at them also. And then to really tick off the religious leaders, Jesus taught of the 7 woes. Listen to just a few of the things he says in Matthew chapter 23. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! Woe to you, blind guides! You snakes! You brood of vipers! How will you escape being condemned to hell? Now do you begin to understand? Jesus set the stage for his crucifixion. He executed the fight perfectly. The Jewish religious leaders played directly into his hands so that he established when he was to die, established how he was to die, and established who it was that would bring about his death. That day of Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem, he had that entire event planned out. He had prepared 33 years for that battle. The question that we come to today is, are you prepared for your battle? You say what, Kenny? What do you mean, battle? Didn't you know that Jesus expects us to fight in this war also? The battle still goes on. Paul tells us to put on the armor of God. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 11, he says, put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. We are to be prepared for battle. You didn't know that order was for you? Well, let's see what Jesus says about this warfare and our combat. Matthew chapter 16, verse 24. Then Jesus said to his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Take up your cross means you've got to be ready to die. If you're going to follow Jesus, if you're going to be a Christian, you've got to be ready to die for him. You've got to be ready to fight. Next verse, verse 25, Jesus says, for whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will find it. If we're so concerned about our preservation of life and our lifestyle of ease, Jesus said, you're going to lose your life eternally. But if you don't worry about this life and you do his work, we will gain eternal life. But Jesus didn't stop. And he's got something to say for us, the American church. I mean, this hits us right between the eyes in verse 26. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Doesn't this describe the American church today? We're caught up in things. We're caught up in possessions. We're caught up in lifestyle. We're caught up in happiness. Jesus is saying the battle, if we're going to win the battle, we've got to set those things aside. And we've got to be more focused on the battle than what we are focused on gaining the world and our lifestyle. How much are we willing to give up to fight the battle that Jesus calls us to do? Jesus gave up everything that he had in the heavenly realms to come to earth. And then while on earth, Jesus gave up everything that he had for his ministry and to come down to this last battle that we're going to be talking about come Friday and then on Easter. Jesus had a battle to fight, and he was fixated on that battle. He had to win. The question for us today is, what battle are you fixated on? What's your battle? We've got one. Maybe it's an internal battle. Maybe there's some sin that you're battling and you're just kind of looking at it casually, saying, well, that's okay. I don't have to worry about it. No, it's a battle. It's a battle against Satan. Put on the full armor and fight. But the battle isn't only interior, it's also exterior, between one another. Not that we're fighting one another, but we fight the spiritual aspect of winning people to Jesus, standing up for Jesus, being a light shining for Jesus so that they can see Jesus by means of us. The question each of us have to answer today is, what is your individual battle? What is Kenyon Raiders' battle? What is your battle? And how are you going to fight it? Jesus entered Jerusalem that day to fight the mother of all battles. He was prepared. Are you prepared for your battle? And what's your strategy?